Welcome back to this special Islam Channel feature, responding to the Panorama documentary that was aired on Sunday evening, Faith, Hate and Charity. Now, a few minutes ago, before the break, we were talking to Mr. Moin Rabini, who is the author of a report, Islamic Social Welfare Organizations, a Legitimate Threat. Mr. Rabini, are you there?
Yes, if I could just correct you. The author of the report was the International Crisis Group. It's not individual authorship. It was a publication published by the organization, not an individual.
That correction. Can you tell me a bit about the purpose of the report?
Well, the purpose of the report was that at the time there was much discussion about the actual role and functions of Islamic charities deemed to be affiliated with the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, in the occupied territories. And there was discussion about whether these organizations were, by their very nature or by definition, considered an illegitimate sector, or whether there was a need to look more closely at their actual activities and see whether they should be based on their conduct rather than their identity. That's kind of the general background of that report.
And what would you say were the conclusions? Would you say that the report determined that Islamic social welfare organizations were actually a force for good, or were they a force for bad? Were they, on the whole, affiliated to militant organizations such as Hamas?
Well, I think there were several conclusions of the report. One of them was that the entire question of affiliation is by nature problematic because it gets into the whole question of how do you define affiliation and what does affiliation actually mean, and a whole set of other rather complex political issues. And I would say that the main conclusion of the report regarding these individual organizations was that where there were concerns about them engaging in illicit or illegitimate activities, then they should be subject to the same standards of proof that are normally used with other non-governmental organizations and so on, that, where there is evidence of them not carrying out the activities that they claim to carry out, and where there is evidence that they are, for example, serving to shift funds to military activities or whatever, then clearly they should be held accountable. But in cases where they're doing exactly what they claim to be doing in terms of providing social welfare services, and there is no evidence to the contrary, then they should be dealt with on that basis as legitimate social welfare organizations.
Thank you. Derek Dibble, you mentioned that there were some issues in some of the issues raised that you'd like to address.
Yeah. One point Mr. Rabini made about the government and its reaction to the activities of Interpol. I just want to make it clear that the Charity Commission, as regulator of charities in England and Wales, is independent from government. It does not act at the direction of ministers. It's independent. It can only exercise its powers on the basis of evidence, as Mr. Rabini was asserting in relation to the general processes which need to go through on censure of any organisation, and it's answerable for its actions in the courts. So the Commission has to assess and act on a clear evidence in relation to wrongdoing or allegations of wrongdoing in any charity, and I hope that gives proper assurances to the Muslim community that the Commission's involvement in this case will be absolutely impartial, and it will deliver its expertise in the way it's done before in relation to Interpol and its other investigations.
I'd like to just ask you a quick question before I move on to Dr. Phyllis Starkey, who I know is pressing to raise an issue there. One of the individuals mentioned in the documentary was Mohammed Sawalha, who I understand has done some work with the Charity Commission in respect of the Finsbury Park Mosque. Could you give us an elucidate on his involvement there?
I wouldn't want to speak about that because I don't know about it directly.
All right, okay. Phyllis, if you want to.
Yes, I used to take a couple of points up about the reality on the ground in Palestine and the way in which these Islamic welfare organisations operate. The first is that all the schools and hospitals that I visited when I was in the West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza in September last year were providing absolutely vital services. The Palestinian Authority, even at that point, just did not have the funding or the capacity to provide services for everyone, even though they tried to do so. And if it was not for the additional facilities provided by many of these Islamic welfare associations, then many people would not have access to education or to medical facilities. And all the schools were operating the Palestinian national curriculum and were complying with what the Palestinian Ministry of Education required, and all the hospitals were also working with the Palestinian Ministry of Health and were liaising with them so that they were maximising medical services and complementarity between those facilities and the facilities provided by the PA itself. So that to threaten any of those organisations would be to deprive ordinary people of services which are absolutely vital. And the second point I wanted to make was that much of John Ware's information, as I understand it, came from the Israeli security services and from the hard disks that they had confiscated from Palestinian NGOs. And a major tactic of the Israeli authorities is to confiscate all the records of Palestinian NGOs, to trawl through them for anybody who may be connected in any way whatsoever with the individual organisations, who may also be connected with Hamas or other groupings, the PFLP, all the other factions within Palestine, and to add it to their enormous database on the entire Palestinian population for use later on. And it's extraordinary that John Ware thought that that sort of information which is frankly, absolutely outrageous that a foreign government is compiling on citizens of another state, that sort of information is the sort of information he should use to try and discredit organisations which are working for the good of ordinary Palestinians. And I think he should be ashamed of himself. And I have written to the BBC complaining vigorously and suggesting that Mr Ware should go back to Palestine, and if anything happens to these organisations, that he should explain directly to the individuals who are thereby deprived of access to education and health exactly why he's done it.
Good for you. I honestly, that was a wonderful, strong statement, and it so needs to be said, because we shouldn't just sweep the documentary like this under the table. So why are we discussing this? Why is this important? On a personal basis, I'll tell you why it's important. Had I seen this documentary before I had met Interpol representatives in this country, I would never have gone to Palestine, much less have visited any of their centres to see their work. I was invited 2 years ago by an Interpol representative over here. As a journalist, Lauren Booth, please will you come and witness our work? So very keen to show that the money from British people goes directly to the ground, to the poorest. So I went over on a journalistic visit and made a side visit to some of the work, and what I saw there was very moving indeed. I met a girl called Sajida in Bethlehem, for example, at a centre, who was taking toys to orphans during a celebration week, and I said to her, well, the elections are coming up soon, can I be cheeky and ask how you vote? She said, absolutely not. Nobody here, not even amongst ourselves, will be voting, and I'll tell you why, because we work for a charity. Now that was rare, and it's not necessary, I don't think, for all the people on the ground to distance themselves from their heartfelt feelings in order to do good work for a charity. But I'm telling you, in this case, there are people out there very committed to the ideals straight down the line of Interpol as a charity that helps the neediest, and that's what I witnessed.
There is a crucial question, and I keep coming to you, Kenneth, I hope you don't mind. You said that there was some important new evidence that you had picked up in the documentary that you felt justified a re-investigation. Most of what you've heard here today suggests it's a rehash of the same old conjecture.
Not so much new evidence, but a new focus on the fact that the allegations seem to be around the indirect support for terrorist activity rather than the direct support. So the money, it is alleged, is paid to these organisations operating, doing, as has been set out, crucial humanitarian work amongst Palestinians. But those organisations separately have an involvement in a political process, and that political process, it is alleged, suggests a terrorist involvement. And I think that's the sort of area the Commission will want to look at when it goes through the evidence that's been presented by this programme.
Dr. Abdullah.
Just to take up from where Kenneth left off, I think it is important to look at the methodology adopted by John Weah in the programme, and the imbalanced manner in which he uses the sources. There's a clear, preference for Israeli and American information, and an unwillingness to accept information from Palestinian sources. So this is one. And then there's the issue of the inference and conjecture that Kenneth was referring to, and with relationship to the facts. Now there is a shield in a school, and there's blood on it, and he infers from that Islam will drown the world in blood. But there is another interpretation that the Muslim world is flooded with the blood of its people because of invasions, because of occupations, and aggression on themselves by foreigners. But, his methodology is one that does not look at the Muslim side of things. It looks at it through the spectacles of the Israelis and the Americans. And when we come to the issue of jihad again, he interprets it in a manner which is totally inconsistent with the most fundamental understanding of jihad. Jihad is not about mayhem, it's not about killing and destruction. It is about bringing out the most noble aspects of one's humanity. And John Weah has to understand these fundamental principles of Islam before he makes a documentary of this kind.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah. Sir Iqbal Sakrani, there was a much reference made to the term dawah in the documentary. It was suggested or inferred somehow that this was some code word for some military activity or something that was in breach of normal legislation and regulation. What did you make of that?
Of dawah, sorry? The
dawah.
Dawah, yes, sorry, the dawah, yes. You see, the principal objective of any charitable institution is to serve the poor, the needy, and this is part of the faith. And that is dawah. The dawah is to convey the goodness, the message of, to how to help, to assist. This is part to educate. This is the word dawah. Now, it is a principle which has been adhered by more or less just about every charitable institution, particularly the Islamic institution, because the purpose is how best you serve, because it is self-sacrifice. It is people give their own time, money in helping the others. But the concept which is, I think, he's trying to draw up on that is deliberately to misconstrue. And again, this follows a particular theme that he's adopted early on. And that is the issue of political Islam. Islam which enables you to speak against injustices, to speak against aggression, occupation. Sorry? So it's a matter of trying to silence that particular approach that is being taken. And what worries us most, that there is a deliberate attempt to sidetrack the present crisis in what is taking place in Palestine. What we see now, at the moment the attention is totally on Lebanon, the atrocities committed. But nobody knows now, somehow there is a news blackout on daily people being killed in Palestine. The very same organizations which Interpol and many others are trying to assist and support, what are they going through at the moment? Are we aware that even at the moment the funds are being blocked by banking, by financial institutions? So I think they somehow to cripple, the economy has been crippled, the political system has been crippled. Now what they want to do is cripple the hearts and the minds of the ordinary Palestinians. But not knowing that these tactics have been applied in the past, they have failed. These people are resilient, they are standing for justice, they know they are living under occupation. The whole tone is being changed. The victims are being made aggressors, and the aggressors are being made victims.
I'd like to add something there. That goes very much with what I saw on a visit to Ramallah and Nablus earlier this year. And I spoke to one of the girls who worked again for an Al-Lod charity or one of the other societies, and I said, why do you think that your charities are being maligned abroad, the ones that do the most crucial work in Palestine. And she said, as you said, they're just trying to destroy our politics, they're destroying our infrastructure. The only money we have coming in is from NGOs and charities. If they take that, they will starve us off our land. It's the last way of ridding this area of any Palestinians. And that's the feeling, that they are being deliberately targeted unfairly when all they're trying to do is survive. And that certainly is
and
what I
you see,
felt.
the other point we must not forget that it is to the credit of our major international charities in the UK. For the first time, it's unprecedented. People like Oxfam, Christian Aid, Unison, all these major international bodies coming in together with Muslim Aid, Islamic Relief and the Muslim Council of Britain, standing firm and clear that this sort of what we see, the atrocities being committed up here, who are they endangering? They're endangering the ordinary civilian communities. So I think it's shameful, really, on our government and all these other major Western countries observing, and more or less giving a further impetus, green light to those atrocities being committed. So I think somehow the situation that we are seeing at the moment, of course, it is very dire. It has major consequences on the communities over there, but we also need to reflect ourselves as to what can be done to prevent this further atrocities carried out.
So carry on, Dr.
I'm sorry, but I think before we come to an end, it's important that I say something about the other side. Last year, an Israeli writer named Gideon Levy, he wrote in the Haaretz that there are pogroms being committed in Hebron. This is a city in the West Bank. He says that young girls, they have to run the gauntlet to get to school, and that there is ethnic cleansing in that city. Now, what about the charities that fund these settlers who commit these atrocities? Is anyone, undertaking an inquiry into these charities? What about those who go and serve in the IDF, like the French who was, captured in Gaza? Surely there are Britons, or British Jews who go and do it. Are we not going to? When are we going to investigate them? And stop the flow of funds to such individuals and institutions that commit, such acts of aggression on innocent people. I think the time is now.
You've heard a recommendation that there should be investigations into other charities who are funding illicit activities in the same region from the other side, as has been mentioned. But before you answer to that, I'd like to just make another point. I regularly converse with other charities such as Oxfam, Christian Aid, Médecins Sans Frontières and so on, and many of those charities who are working in the occupied territories are constantly being bombarded with similar allegations. Even the European Union has been classified as a terrorist entity by the Israeli Zionist bodies. You must be bombarded with similar allegations for those other rather larger charities in Interpol.
On the contrary, we're not. And if allegations are made in relation to that area which you're referring to, we will look at them in the same impartial way we'll look at this, these current allegations which have been made in the Panorama programme.
And in response to Dr. Abdullah's point, whether there should be investigations into the illicit activities of other charities, which are quite known to many of us, how do you respond to that?
Well, we need to see a formal complaint, a complaint which is corroborated through evidence, through which we can assess and consider whether to use our powers of investigation and remedy against these charities. But in the absence of complaints of that kind, the Commission proceeds on the basis that these charities are operating in accordance with the legal framework. And the Commission does need evidence from which it can act.
Dr. Starkey.
I think that people in this country who are concerned about the situation in Palestine have not looked closely enough at international law and the way in which international law could be used to prevent funds flowing from this country to, for example, the illegal settlements in the occupied territories. And I think that people who are well versed in international law ought to be directing their energies at that, and so that we can cut off those funds which are going from people within Britain to support that illegal activity.
Hey, I'll tell you who's good at international law, Cherie Blair. Perhaps we could ask her.
And, I know that War on Want, for example, at the moment is drawing people's attention to the way in which certain firms that are active in this country are themselves essentially propping up the occupation. Both supermarkets, for example, who are relabelling goods that have been produced in illegal settlements and packaging them up with goods that have been produced within Israel itself and labelling the whole thing as made in Israel. I do think it's important that people in Britain use all the freedoms that we do have within a democratic society, and consumer boycotts and consumer action is something that every single one of us can take, as well as making it clear to firms like JCB and Caterpillar that we as individuals within our society think it wholly reprehensible that their products are being used to further Israeli military activity in the occupied territories. So I think that there are all sorts of weapons that we can quite legitimately use within a democratic society which are not being used as effectively as they could be. And certainly I take the Charity Commission's point that they can't investigate something unless somebody makes a complaint and unless that complaint provides the evidence to back it up.
Sticking with you just for a moment, Dr. Starkey, I would like to ask you what you feel that should be the role of our government in situations like this. Interpal has been investigated on 2 occasions. We've heard there were thorough investigations. More recently, the Board of Deputies of British Jews were pursued in a libel case, and they had the most substantial resources at their disposal, as you can imagine, and that ended with an apology and costs, or we don't know the figures, but those costs were quite substantial, we understand. Now, the British government in all this has been accused of not being proactive in assisting a bona fide British charity from removing the coils of inhibition that have limited their ability to perform such a crucial function to the needy in Palestine, Lebanon and Jordan. It is a point to mention that subsequent to the designation in the US, all international funding had to cease because of the imposition of regulations by the US on the banking system internationally. And that affected 1/3 of the income of that charity. That is not a small sum of money to take from the mouths of the children and women who are suffering in the occupied territories. What do you feel the government should be doing? Should they be more proactive? Can they be more proactive?
Well, as you know, I've raised this directly with the Treasury. I mean, on the issue of the complaints made against Interpal, the government, in my view, quite properly has said that there is a route, which is complaints to the Charity Commission. The Charity Commission is independent of government. It wouldn't be proper for the government to interfere, but the government absolutely accepts the findings of the Charity Commission. On the issue of the US authorities, the Treasury line is that it is for the US authorities how they designate bodies, but of course that the British authorities have not followed suit and are not intending to designate Interpal themselves, and they decline to actively intercede with the US authorities. I'm disappointed in that, but I suspect that the US authorities have a rather lower threshold for evidence than on many issues than the British government would have, and I guess that the British government feels that there are all sorts of other battles it needs to fight, and this is not one of the ones it wishes to fight with the US authorities. But you know, I think that it is a great pity that the British government has not chosen to at least challenge the level of evidence that the US government has acted upon, but ultimately that is a decision that the US government has to be beholden to its own electorate. And I'm sad that, for example, Arab Americans have not been more active in holding their own government to account.
I do think I'm glad you raised the question of harassment, because I don't know who's supposed to be taking care of Interpal. They seem to be standing on their own, but there is no question that there is a form of harassment going on, and sadly this documentary seems to be a part of it, which is no good for an independent BBC documentary to be seen as such. I have to say that when I went over to visit on a journalism trip to Palestine earlier this year, and I was going to visit 2 centres for Interpal, I was personally harassed by telephone from Israeli agents calling from Tel Aviv and making threats. Now I have that phone call taped. When I went back through Tel Aviv, I was told, we don't like what you're doing, we know where you live, basically. We don't like you, we know where you've lived. And that was all because you've been to see an Interpal charity. As a member of the Free Press, how dare you harass me?
I remember, Dr. Starkey, you also had some problems when you went to visit Gaza. At the checkpoint, you had a meeting with the Prime Minister, I think, in fact, on that occasion.
Yes, indeed.
And
with the President.
With the President, sorry.
Yes. President Abbas. Yes, I was stuck at the Gaza checkpoint for 8 hours, I think,
8 hours.
before I finally got through. And I guess I've no idea why they suddenly decided I could go. I wasn't going to ask. I just said thank you very much and legged it through the checkpoint as fast as I could go. But I'm very well aware that as a British Member of Parliament, I'm in a much more protected position than an ordinary member of the public. And I don't have any shame at all in using that protected position to get me through and to enable me to meet with people in Gaza at that point, which was just a week after the Israeli disengagement, and then to use those contacts to make points in the British Parliament.
Unfortunately, we have come to the close of our programme. We have a few seconds left. I think we hopefully have given a lot of food for thought to our viewers. I think that overwhelmingly you will find that the Islam Channel audience, the viewers, will be bombarding government and the Charity Commission with possibly various bits of new evidence on new cases in the next while. Thank you very much for tuning in, and salam alaikum.